second and final podcast. We'll pick it up on page 7 of your notes, which is section 4 in the reading, The Search for Peace and Political Stability. This last part of the chapter is going to cover the political and economic issues in the aftermath of World War I, which again are pointing all of us toward the Second World War. The first part of the chapter dealt with culture and art, film and music, and then this last part picks up with the political and economic side. Section A. The Versailles Treaty, as we know, when you read it in class the other day, did not ultimately keep the peace. It was very strict. It was meant to be enforced, but it was never enforced the way that it was written. There was a whole host of attitudes toward that treaty immediately after it was passed. The Germans, first of all, hated it. As you know, they hated the part particularly about guilt and reparations more than anything else. The French, immediately after the First World War, felt very isolated because the U.S. and Britain had backed out of the military alliance that we had promised the French and that the French were so desperate to have. The British essentially moved away from Europe. They started to develop back to their British views. They thought, well, that was over. They became sort of an independent force in Europe and no longer wanted to really be a part of European affairs. The United States was gone out of the picture. We left Europe. We didn't pass the treaty. We walked away from international affairs and became essentially isolationist. And the Russians had nothing to do with the Treaty of Versailles, but as you know, had become a communist dictatorship under Lenin immediately after, during and after the war. So you have a lot going on in Europe as you approach the 1920s. The theme of the 1920s in Europe is really recovery and democracy, at least in most places, not in Germany, but in most of the rest of Europe, it's recovery and democracy. And in the 30s, things start to go south as you head up to World War II. Depression, the Great Depression, and the rise of fascism and totalitarianism. So Germany and the Western powers. The Germans, again, really did not like the Versailles Treaty. They hated it, and they demanded that it be revised as soon as possible. They asked for revisions. The French demanded reparations. They wanted that payment to be made for the costs of the war. They were in favor of the treaty as it was written, and they wanted it to be enforced. And yet, when it started to slip, the French felt betrayed. When the military alliance with the U.S. and Britain broke down, they felt even more betrayed. And they called very clearly for strict implementation of the treaty as it was written. So they were unwilling to budge on any of its terms. The British softened their position on Germany in the years right after the war. Even though they had signed off on it, they softened up and they realized that it was in their best interest to trade with Germany again and do business with them. And again, the war wasn't fought in Britain, it was fought in France, so there wasn't as many memories of actual battlefield damage. And they'd lost a lot of men, but they weren't quite as close to the action, let's say, as the French were. At this point in Britain, a very important economist writes a very famous piece called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, and that economist is John Maynard Keynes, very important individual. And his book lays out why the Versailles Treaty needed to be revised. They said if you don't back off on these demands for reparations from Germany and the strict punishment of Germany, it's going to destroy the German economy, which in turn will destroy the European economy, which in turn will destroy the British economy, which will have repercussions for the whole world. So he said this is a bad treaty, it needs to be revised. And the people of Britain sort of got on board with him right away and started pushing for revisions to the treaty. One thing you need to know about Keynes for the future is that when we got into the Great Depression in the world, he published what we would now today call Keynesian theory, his last name, Keynesian theory, which says that when a country is in a depression or a recession, the way to get out of it is that the government of that country has to spend money. They have to pump money into the economy one way or another. Government spending is the key to get out of recession. And this was a new idea. Most people in the 1920s and 30s did not believe it was the role of government to do that. So his theory is, of course, more widely accepted today. You remember the so-called bailouts in our own economy in the last 8 years. I hope you've heard that term. Those were examples of Keynesian theory putting into action. but this was all new stuff in the 1920s and 30s. The British are also continually suspicious of the French, even though they were allies in World War I. They're really more older enemies than they are allies. And so the French-British relationship broke down, which actually pushed the British slightly closer to being willing to soften up on Germany. The amount of reparations that everyone demanded, $33 billion in US dollars, incredible sum of money. And the new German government was known as the Weimar Republic, and they could not pay. They were destroyed after the war, and they couldn't make that first payment. So they didn't. They actually made one payment, and then they stopped. This was how far they got. And the French prime minister at the time was a fellow named Raymond Poincaré, who demanded that the Germans make all their payments. And you kind of think of this analogy. If you don't make a payment on your car, someone's going to come and repossess it eventually. Well, that's what the French decided to do to Germany. They made one payment and then they stopped, and the French decided to repossess a part of Germany's Ruhr area, Ruhr district, R-U-H-R. This is the industrial area of Western Germany, as you see on this map. It's a red area. This is where all the best factories are, all the natural resources and minerals. Very valuable area to the Germans. And the French invaded it and repossessed it as a way to get their money out of the Germans. If they don't make payments, then we're going to come in, occupy your industrial district, take over your factories, and take the products of your factories as payment instead of cash. So it's a really serious situation. This is an invasion. The rest of the world did not accept this. The Western Britain, the U.S. were very concerned, but France acted unilaterally here. And they were so mad at us for having backed out of our potential military alliance that they took matters into their own hands. The German reaction was the workers went on strike. They essentially stopped working. And the government of Germany encouraged that. They said, you don't have to work for French soldiers at gunpoint. Just stop working. So they encouraged passive resistance. Here you see a picture of French soldiers essentially ordering German citizens, civilians, to go work so that the French could take their money that they were owed from the treaty. So turning over to page 8, the government was sort of ordering the people to not work, or encouraging it at least passively, but these workers needed money, and to keep the workers happy, the government started printing money, a lot of money. And something like a huge percentage of the German workforce actually was part of this Ruhr area right at that time. So it was a lot. It was a big deal. It was actually an incredible sum of money. What ends up happening is that when you print money on a massive scale, you get hyperinflation, where the money starts to lose its value. And hyperinflation is where it goes really fast and it devalues just incredibly quickly. This is a problem. This is going to provoke all kinds of social tensions. Germans start to blame other people for their troubles. They start to blame minority groups, Jews and other groups particularly. This is familiar. And they began to be willing to follow radical political leaders, which, as you know, are going to rise up pretty quickly. So it's a really dangerous situation. I'll show you a graph here in a minute that explains how bad it was. Something like 10% of Germany's population in 20, 21, 22, 23 was connected to the Ruhr area, and they were being paid with this printed money from the government. So this is a problem. So here's some of the data. The value of German marks, one paper mark compared to a gold mark. You can see that the paper money just becomes completely worthless over the span of 5 years. This is known as the hyperinflation crisis. Here's some more pictures. This is how highly the bills had to be printed, the 50 million mark banknote. But yet you could only buy bread or something very small with this amount of money. So they just were printing it in higher values, but it still wasn't worth anything. Famous pictures in German history from 1923 when you saw people burning their money in their fireplace for heat rather than spend it because you couldn't buy anything with it. Even more famous examples would be here, children playing with blocks of cash because it, again, couldn't buy anything. You might as well play with it. Famous pictures of people wheeling wheelbarrows full of money to the bank. This would be maybe a day's pay or a morning's pay, and yet they still couldn't buy much with it. People would be paid several times a day, and they'd have to go buy groceries several times a day because the prices were going up so quickly and the money was losing its value so fast that you had to just stay ahead of the madness. Here's another picture of these guys wheeling wheelbarrows full of cash from their workplace over to a bank across the street. And then once again, a woman lighting her stove using the paper currency as kindling to light your stove rather than spend it. So this is one of the worst periods of German history. The German leader at the time was Gustav Stresemann, who was sort of a moderate, and he eventually sort of called on the world and said, mercy, we need mercy here. We're in trouble. We will work with you to make our payments. We need help. So he sort of called everybody to the table for negotiations. Here's a commemorative coin. The 1st of November 1923, a pound of bread cost 3 million German marks, a pound of meat, Fleisch, 36 million, and most importantly to Germans, ein Glas Bier, 4 million German marks. So this was as bad as it ever has been. Here's Gustav Stresemann, again, calling for some sort of renegotiation to help the Germans get out of this mess. The solution was really the Dawes Plan. This was by an American banker named Charles Dawes, who went over to Europe and renegotiated the reparations, and they reduced the number of reparations that were required of Germany. Sort of like going bankrupt, some of your debts get called off. The U.S. promised that we would give Germany loans to pay the rest of Europe back, and then the rest of Europe actually had debts that they were going to pay back to America, and it was going to be this circle where everyone was using American dollars eventually to pay back its loans to somebody else. So we thought we would do okay with this. This actually worked. It was appeasing enough to the nations involved, and recovery ended up being relatively quick and successful. They also tied, for a short period of time, the value of the German mark to the U.S. dollar to give it some stability. So the Dawes Plan was essentially a U.S. bailout of Europe's economy. Now you move forward out of the economic world, we move to the political world at this point, and you have some treaties signed called the Locarno Agreement and the Kellogg-Briand Pact that were more political in nature to try to settle disputes lingering from World War I. Border disputes were settled at Locarno. There was a spirit of Locarno, a spirit of goodwill emerged from that negotiation. Locarno is a city in Switzerland where people promised to cooperate on matters of security and international affairs moving forward. Maybe even more important would be this Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was signed by the U.S. Secretary of State Frank Kellogg and the French Foreign Minister, whose name was Briand. It sounds like Kellogg brand, sounds like a cereal pact. And this was signed by many countries in the world that said they would never go to war again against each other. They renounced war as a tool of foreign policy. People think this was maybe very, very optimistic, perhaps too optimistic, foolishly optimistic for the time. And the U.S. in the Kellogg-Briand Pact agreed to take a stronger role in Europe after having not done so in the first 8 years of the decade, really, except for the Dawes Plan. So a lot of hope. This was called Hope in Foreign Affairs. This section, there was a lot of optimism and hope for the future, but these agreements are going to break down. They're not going to make it. And an example of political stability already breaking down, we move into Section D, is that right away you've got the radicals in Germany. It's in 1923. It's the height of the hyperinflation crisis, and Adolf Hitler and his young friends, who are known as the National Socialists, the Nazis, a brand new political party after World War II, tried to take over the government of Germany in a famous beer hall putsch. A putsch is the German word for coup, and like most things in Germany that are important, they happen in beer halls. This was in Munich, and they stood up on a table and started giving speeches saying they were the new government of Germany at the peak of the hyperinflation crisis, and they were quickly shouted down and arrested and sent to jail. They were just a raggedy group of guys at this point, not mainstream at all. So he served a short prison sentence of just a few months, and while he was in prison, he wrote his famous manifesto, Mein Kampf, means my struggle. And this was sort of the Bible of National Socialism. moving forward. Again, his party is known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and it primarily attracted people with anger after World War I. So lots of people were, it was a small group right at the beginning, as I said. It wasn't a big political party. It was some anti-Semites, some super nationalistic people, and mainly the bitter ex-war veterans from the First World War. This was not a major party yet. They're going to make a comeback, though, and they will be, but not yet. So they get arrested, they get shut down. A couple of them are actually killed, but in prison, he wrote his book. Turn to page 9. The government of Germany at this point in the 20s and 30s is known as the Weimar Republic, named after the German city of Weimar. And this was the government created right after World War I, when there was a lot of political infighting. That political infighting between different parties continued through the 20s and 30s. The Weimar Republic was never very stable. It was always a shaky government for the whole 14 years that it was around. They were the ones that were dealing with the hyperinflation crisis and the Dawes Plan. It was technically a democracy with regular elections. A lot of businessmen started to take the lead in the Weimar Republic, moderates. The U.S. and Britain was very happy with the Weimar Republic and hoped that it would continue as the main government of Germany. We had positive relations with them. But the main problem in the Weimar Republic is that there were a lot of other political groups on the fringes, the edges, that were really unhappy and angry and made it their mission to destroy the Weimar Republic, who they thought was weak and guilty of having lost the war and signed the treaty that ended the war. So we have extremists on both sides in Germany. You have the National Socialists, Nationalists, Monarchists, the Army. These are the right-wingers. The NSDAP is the abbreviation for the Nazi Party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The German abbreviation is NSDAP. On the left wing are communists, which is known as the Kommunistische Partei Deutschland, KPD. And then in the middle, the center-left socialists, or the moderate socialists, they're known as the SPD, the Sozialistische Partei Deutschland. So none of those are actually the Weimar Republic, who is a whole different group of politicians. So you have essentially 4 competing groups. It's a mess, and it's going to break down by the late 20s and early 30s. So switching over from Germany in the 20s to France in the 1920s, particularly Paris, coalitions of moderates politically start to govern France. The main themes here, they rebuild the damaged war areas, which were in the northeastern part of the country. The French also experienced some small economic crises that they recovered from. It was not nearly as bad as Germany. But the main thing that France is remembered for in the 1920s and 30s was that it was a gathering place for all kinds of artists and intellectuals. Paris in the 20s was really dynamic and thriving, an intellectual scene on the left bank of the River Seine in Paris. Expatriates, so people from other countries, particularly veterans, a lot of intellectual veterans stayed in Europe after World War I and started making Paris their home. And we call these guys ultimately the lost generation. And you have famous artists, famous writers and authors that gather in Paris, and they all kind of hang out at the home of Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein was an intellectual woman, an American woman who had gone to live in Paris as well. And so she set up kind of like a salon, almost like the Enlightenment. She was a salon hostess, and these younger men, who were typically veterans but really intellectual guys who had served briefly in the war and then stayed in Europe. They didn't want to come back to America. They would gather at her home for these discussions. So the lost generation is Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Hemingway's very famous works, The Sun Also Rises, Farewell to Arms, F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, Ezra Pound, John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath. These people all were living and writing in Paris in the 20s. It was a really sort of neat cultural scene. Of course, the themes of their book were all very depressing and dreary and hopeless, and it's about innocence lost and youth misspent, and a lot of these guys ended up with really rough lives, and they didn't end well. Some of them committed suicide. Their marriages were terrible if they had any. So their lives weren't great, but their literature lives on. Now, Britain in the 1920s is characterized by the welfare state. That's the thing we want to remember. The government is going to take care of the people of Britain from cradle to grave. High unemployment in the 20s, up to 23% in 1921 after the war. The Labour Party takes over. The Labour Party is the left-wing party. They're sort of the socialist party. They represent the workers, the labor force. So that's they're the ones that want the welfare state, where you have unemployment benefits. The government helps you when you're struggling. That's the welfare state. The prime minister at the time is Ramsay MacDonald, and they take over for different political parties that had come out of fashion. The conservatives, which were the Tories, and the liberals, which were the Whigs, which we learned about in old chapters. Those guys are gone. And from this point forward, the Labour Party is sort of the new game in town. They believe in gradual socialism, which is the revisionist version of socialism, where you're going to make those small changes over time. We're not going to have a communist revolution like in Russia. Work within the system to gain rights for workers. One other just sort of random thing happening after World War I in Britain is that Ireland was granted independence in 1922, finally after centuries of mistreatment by the British. But not all of Ireland wanted to be independent. The 6 northern counties of Ireland wanted to stay part of the United Kingdom. Those are Protestant areas where the Protestant Reformation had actually taken hold centuries before that. So the Northern Ireland is still joined to the UK, Britain, and it's Protestant, whereas the rest of Ireland is now a republic since 1922, and they're primarily Catholic. On to page 10, moving forward. This is a section now that's going to deal with the Great Depression, which is our last section of the book. The Great Depression starts in America, you know that. It's known for its severity, how severe it was, its duration, how long it lasted. It never really ended until the Second World War started with the whole change in economics. And as you well know, the support for radical leaders during the Great Depression in Europe is one of the most memorable things of that period. Those radical leaders who promised solutions. And we have radical leaders that were Democrats, believing in democracy. Like even in the U.S., Franklin D. Roosevelt was a radical politician at the time. And then there's undemocratic folks as well, particularly in Europe, as we know, with the rise of fascism, Mussolini and Hitler. So there's no widespread agreement on the cause of the Great Depression. It's disputed and debated to this day. We remember that this begins in the U.S. with the stock market crash in 1929 leading up to those. That year, the U.S. was known as being in the roaring 20s when the economy was great. People were buying stocks left and right, somewhat recklessly. They were buying stocks on margin, which means people were borrowing money to buy stocks. So they would only put, let's say, 10% down to buy a portfolio of stocks, and then if that portfolio went down, they would lose not only their investment, but now someone would come after them for the original loan. So it's a very risky mindset that people were operating in the 20s. The stock market in the U.S. crashed in October 1929 on Black Tuesday. These things happen once in a while in the world where there's one-day drops of substance in the stock market, and it triggers financial crises around the world. People panic, they freak out, and they stop spending money. They start withdrawing money from banks. The American bankers called in loans from Europe that were owed to us by the Europeans, going back to the Dawes Plan, and you have a shortage of currency in the world, stops circulating in the world. Recession kicks in by 1930 or 31. The output of goods had fallen around the world by 38%. Countries started putting up tariffs and practicing what we call protectionism, where you don't trade with other people. They're trying to buy only your own goods so that you recover. So all that happens very, very quickly, starting in the U.S. and then spreading around the world. Why is it so severe? Why is this so bad? There was a lack of international leadership, especially in Britain and the U.S., from economists. This had never really happened before, so we were unprepared to deal with it. There were also very poor economic policies in place in most countries in the world at that time, and a lack of spending by governments. As I mentioned, no one believed in Keynesian theory until it got so bad. Section B, mass unemployment. 18% in Britain, 33% in the U.S., 45% in Germany at the peak of the Depression. That's incredible numbers of people out of work. Here they are in Britain lining up for welfare benefits, begging for assistance. Consequences, well, poverty, widespread. People got married later in life, if not at all, or not at all, because they didn't have any money to support a family. People had fewer children than ever before because there wasn't enough money to support them. There was lots of suicide in the 1930s. Mental illness was on the rise. People lost everything. They lost their home, sometimes their marriage, and then sometimes their mind. They were hungry. There was starvation. And the quote from the bottom of the page, hungry men are angry men. And those angry men can be pulled into different political philosophies that they might not have ordinarily supported. Go on to page 11. In the U.S., I'm not going to talk too much about this. You'll learn this in U.S. history in 11th grade. FDR's programs, there's our president, FDR. He was a radical president. He was a Democrat. He totally transformed the nature of government relationship to the people. Big government programs trying to get us out of the Depression. You see some of them listed here. Maybe the big shift that you come out of this with is that the welfare state starts to develop in the U.S., where before this, Americans thought that they were responsible only for themselves, and the government was not supposed to take care of me. If I get into trouble, I pull myself up, I work hard, and I get out. That doesn't work in the Great Depression. You can't get out. You're stuck. So he got Social Security passed in 1935, which means when you get old, the government gives you money that you've been hopefully paying into for your younger years, but that was a brand new thing. Union membership doubled in America. The New Deal, it's all the New Deal, all these different programs to put people to work, give them money, get money in their pockets. So again, we'll just sort of leave it at that for the U.S. In Scandinavia, they have a whole section on they were the most successful at dealing with the effects of the Great Depression. Actually, the Social Democrat Party, and this is like Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, that's what we mean by Scandinavia. These are socialists, actually, who are in the government making decisions, and they adopt a flexible, non-revolutionary type of socialism where the government's going to take care of people. Really high taxes, but everyone gets some benefits from the government. And they end up with this pattern in Scandinavian society of voluntary cooperation where everybody is kind of the same mind. It's a cultural thing that we're all going to help each other. We're all going to pitch in for the good of the whole, which is socialism. But there was a willingness to participate in it in a way that's really never been seen before. Again, very high taxes. They ran big deficits. The government went into a lot of debt so that the civilians, the workers, the individuals, might survive it. And they end up with what's called a middle way, where they aren't communist like Russia, and they're not still in capitalism like what, for the most part, America was trying to stay in. So they sort of split the difference and became a flexible socialistic society. And that's what worked well. The people in Scandinavia are also very similarly cultured, and they have the same sort of work ethic, and there is not a lot of diversity. There wasn't at that time in their society, so it sort of worked because it was done on a small scale. I think you would want to write that down. It worked in Scandinavia because the nations there were quite small and the people all kind of had the same fundamental beliefs. Flip over to page 12, last page. Recovery in Britain and France. Well, in Britain, the Labour Party is still in charge, led by Ramsay MacDonald, and they pass a balanced budget, which was trying to get their economy back on the right track. By 1937, they had experienced some form of recovery. They as well put up protective tariffs to try to not, they were trying to get British people to buy British goods. But I think the most important thing they did to recover, as mentioned in the book, is that they shifted their economy away from what we would call old industries and toward newer products and markets. So the old industries would be things like textiles and coal. These are Industrial Revolution stuff. New appliances would be consumer goods. So we're going to make cars and appliances instead, and things that people want to buy, that they can buy, smaller things that will actually kickstart the economy once people start buying it. So the British had it better than most places in Europe, except Scandinavia. So relative to France and Germany, the British actually were least affected by the Depression, although it was still quite bad. We'll finish with the French. They were the hardest hit, with the exception of Germany. And the French economy was terrible in the early 30s. There was incredible unemployment, a lot of political instability, a lot of factions and different parties were starting up. There was a fascist movement, which we'll learn about actually in the next chapter, where these are right-wingers. They're really patriotic nationalists. They want to kick out minority groups. They want a strong, powerful leader to make decisions for the good of the country. And then, of course, there's a big communist party in France that wants more like what happened in Russia. They want the government to take care of everybody and have workers be supreme. So lots of instability in France. The only solution was what were called coalition governments. And the one that formed in 1936, when things were about to go off the track, is known as the Popular Front, led by a Frenchman named Leon Blum. And a coalition is when you get groups of political leaders together from different parties for a short-term alliance so that they can pass some laws that are for the good of the country and then move on. So there was this Popular Front is a coalition of communists, socialists, and radicals on the right wing as well. They all came together briefly to make some good reforms, some social and economic reforms, like a 40-hour work week to help the workers. This was not a perfect solution. There was lots of dissent. The fascists, weren't really that supportive of this. There was a civil war in Spain that split the movement as well, and it only lasted for 1 to 2 years. This Popular Front, and it was collapsed by 1937. And meanwhile, France is drifting toward chaos. There was already at this point threats from Hitler and Mussolini, which we'll get into in the next chapter. And France, as you hopefully know, is going to be taken over in World War II by the Germans relatively quickly. So that's the end of chapter 28, The Age of Anxiety.